Hi everybody, this is Liam Martin from Running Remote, and in today's video, we virtually have Sacha Connor. She is literally on our computer screen right now. It's almost as good as in person. The last time that we ended up chatting was actually on a beach, I believe in the Red Sea, correct?
Right, Egypt, Red Sea.
Yeah, so I mean, Sacha's a friend of mine that I've known for quite a while now. She's been to Running Remote before. She's helped us out with Running Remote. And she is also a super powerful remote work consultant. I can give you all of her details. It'll be down in the video description below, but she worked for one of the first remote employees for Clorox. She consults for a whole bunch of companies on how to take companies remote. And that's why we're here today. We are going to be talking about 5 tips to take your Fortune 500, but not really your Fortune 500, maybe just like your biggish company, remote. So Sacha, before we get into it, I mean, I usually talk about tech companies. I usually talk about SaaS companies. Why should big companies go remote? What's the purpose of a big company and how is that process different?
Yeah, I think it's a really good topic for us to talk about right now, because what we see in the headlines right now is all these tech and SaaS companies that are thinking about what does this mean for remote for them. So the Facebooks and the Twitters and Shopify, all of that's coming up. But what's really interesting to me is to see how the non-tech companies are going to adjust and adapt to this situation. So if you think about my background, as you mentioned, I worked for the Clorox company for 14 years. 8 of which I was fully remote. So back in 2010, I became one of the first fully remote marketers as an experiment for the company.
Have you been able to collect any equity? Like, did you get any equity from Clorox? Because I bet you that's a huge win right now, right?
Yes, I did. When I left Clorox about 18 months ago, so some of that transaction had to happen then, but I held on to as much as I could. Good.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Because I mean, the only thing that's going up right now is hand sanitizer and tech companies.
I'm disinfecting wipes and disinfecting products, right?
Exactly.
So I was at that intersection of having this expertise in disinfecting and cleaning and remote work, which are coming both in handy right now.
You couldn't have been in a better place and a better time right now. It is your time. Yeah, so in terms of tips, I mean, I understand the difference between larger companies and you know, larger companies generally move slower. They don't necessarily have the same kind of ability to adapt to new situations like a tech startup would. So I definitely think that there's a lot of things that are different in a remote enterprise company versus like a remote tech startup. But what are our top tips?
Yeah, and the reason I also wanted to think about this too is, you know, Clorox is a 107-year-old company. When I looked at my client list, over half of my clients were 98 years or older as companies.
Wow.
Right? So like thinking about those companies, it's like you said, they're different in terms of the entrenched cultures that they have, the processes that they have, the way they've done things. And so this is a huge change for them. So in terms of those 5 tips, all right, let's start with the first one, which is, so don't take for granted that hybrid will be harder than fully remote. So what's happening right now is a lot of these big organizations moved from working in a hybrid way before that they didn't recognize as being hybrid,
right,
moving all the way to fully remote. So before COVID, people were working virtually. Even if you were in an office setting, you were working virtually. But people who were in these large organizations were not seeing themselves as that. They were very headquarters centric. So all of a sudden we have hopped into being these fully remote organizations, or frogs, as Greg Kaplan from Remote Year says, these frogs. And now everybody's adapting and trying to adjust to the frog situation, which is actually easier than hybrid, right? Everybody is on a even playing field. But then as offices are starting to open back up again, you're going to get some organizations that are going to open their offices and move people back in. And then they're going to be back in these weird hybrid teams that they've never worked in before. And what's going to be really hard about this is something called distance bias. So this is what the Neuro Leadership Institute talks about in their unconscious bias model. So distance bias is our brain's natural tendency to put more importance on the people and the things that are closer to us than those that are further away. And so it's a real physiological phenomenon that happens. And as soon as you get some of the group back co-located again, this distance bias is going to come into effect and cause some strains on the communication and collaboration across the distance.
That's something that Joel Gascoigne from Buffer and he has another term which he calls founder islands, meaning there's a team usually around the founder in remote first teams, and they have ended up getting more access to the executive team as an example versus everyone else, and it creates like a first tier and second tier remote worker. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. So in the 8 years that I worked remote, those executive teams, the majority of the organization were all together on one floor in one building in Oakland, California, and I was 3,000 miles away. And so I had to come up with really intentional plans for how to be able to influence those people and to be able to, be part of the communication that was going on in those, what you're calling founder islands. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So that's a good tip for everyone, I think, because it's such a constant problem that even remote first companies end up having. I know Amir from Doist has told people in Spain they can't live in Barcelona because he lives in Barcelona, specifically to try to actually get people to not be close to him and get better access to him, which is interesting. What's the next tip?
So the next tip is you need to upskill and up tool. So when you're in one of these large organizations that we're talking about, you learn old school techniques and tools. So these kinds of companies have very established leadership training programs, which is great, but they are old school. They are built on the premise of being within earshot and eyeshot of each other and huddling together in rooms together, for example. So what they haven't been taught is how to lead and communicate across distance. So a lot of what I teach with organizations are things like, how do you influence across distance, right? It's different than being able to run into people at the water cooler or the coffee machine or at the elevator, or how to manage people. How do you manage direct report that's remote? How do you work with a remote manager? How do you lead effective virtual meetings, right? They've all been trained on these things. Again, they have training programs, but they never talk about how to do that at a distance.
Got it.
And so what I'm finding is that with a lot of these larger organizations, the first 60 days of COVID, it was all operational fire drills. So are my frontline workers okay? Because a lot of these companies, for example, manufacture physical products, right?
Right.
So working on the frontline workers, making sure that everybody had tech. Some of these companies, some people didn't even have laptops. Like they had to make sure that everybody had a laptop to be able to even work from home. And so now what I'm seeing is that they're starting to be able to pick their heads up and say, okay, now let's check in on our people. How is this going? And this is where we're seeing, wow, okay, productivity is a lot higher than we expected because we really didn't believe in remote work before. But we're on that fine line of getting to burnout because of Zoom fatigue, email overload. This is not normal remote work, right? We are juggling work and life like never before because of COVID. And so what's happening is they didn't have the skills or the tools to help change their ways of working. So they're falling back on meetings and email because that's all they knew how to do.
Right.
And so that's what filled the vacuum. And so a lot of stuff that's taken for granted in SaaS and tech companies, they don't even know about, like video conferencing.
Right.
Like so many of my clients didn't even know how to use video conferencing before I started working with them.
Quick aside of Sacha telling me a very interesting story, which was she was working with a large client, and one of your biggest problems was literally sitting them down and showing them like how to use Zoom, like how to mute everyone in a Zoom call, as an example. And I thought that was so funny and such a good insight for me, because when I hire a tech worker from a tech startup background, I don't have to teach any of that stuff. You've got that out of the box, right? If you don't know how to use Zoom, as an example, you probably have zero tech experience. And it's very interesting to kind of pull my mind out of that and recognize, well, we also have to work for everyone else. Everyone that wants to join remote work isn't going to fit inside of the tech bro box, if I'm going to kind of define it like that. So what's the next tip?
The next tip. So leaders must create company-wide functional and team norms and role model them. So what I'm seeing happening when COVID hit and everybody had to work remotely is that companies are leaving it up to each individual to figure this out. They're kind of leaving it to chance and it to happen organically. And if I think back to 2010 when I went remote, Again, this is like before Zoom. This is, WebEx was maybe just came out, maybe FaceTime maybe had just started to come out. Mm-hmm. I had to relearn how to do everything differently when I was remote. And it felt like I was blindfolded sometimes. It felt like I had a hand tied behind my back at other times. And there was so much extra effort put in to figure out how to do this and create all these new norms. And what organizations need to do, these large organizations, is to set some of these norms at a bigger level so that each individual person doesn't have to spend that time and that energy figuring it out. Especially now when they don't have time to do that because they're juggling, their kids need attention too while they're trying to do the work.
Yeah, no, that's super insightful as well. It just goes to show that for me, remote work for enterprise is definitely a different animal from what we've previously known in our previous experience. The other thing that I'm picking up just from talking to you before we go into our other points is within the next 2 to 3 years, do you think that the remote first or remote work ecosystem will even be like majority tech startups, or do you think it's going to be regular companies in the future? Because as of right now, and as of very much end of May, maybe early June 2020, we've had Twitter, Google, Facebook, and Shopify all declare that they're going, in essence, remotely to various extents. But, we're seeing very large companies that are probably not getting the same amount of press that are going remote as well. And I'm wondering what the makeup is probably going to be in the next 2 to 3 years. Do you think it's still going to be tech startups, which historically it's always been, or do you think it's going to move to the Cloroxes of the world being the majority of remote workers?
I think that you are going to see the tech companies move fastest. I think other companies are being seduced by the real estate cost savings that they are seeing, and they're being seduced by the fact that they're right now saying things like, I wasn't open to remote before, but I think we're actually doing a fairly good job as an organization. Maybe we can do this longer. Most of them, though, are not saying they want to jump 100% remote. Most of them are starting to say, okay, maybe there are certain roles or certain functions that will not be required to be in the office, starting to take a look at what that will mean.
Right.
So I definitely think some of these, Fortune 500 companies that we're talking about will have a larger remote work program than they ever had, or will have their first version of a remote work program that they never had before.
Which I'm sure you could probably help them out with. What are the other 2 points that we've got?
So actually on that note that we were just talking about in terms of thinking about what that remote work plan looks like, the tip is that these companies need to approach whatever this future of work plan is really strategically with 3 legs of the stool. So where I've seen this work the best is if you have a workforce plan, so thinking about the people, a workplace plan, thinking about the real estate and the location plan, and then a technology plan. So what tools are needed and how to use them. And all 3 of those groups, and so in terms of a large organization, you usually have like large groups of HR and real estate and IT. They actually need to be working in concert to create whatever that strategy is. Because the pitfall is if it's led by one group, you normally then will have forgotten or missed out on a big part of this by the time you get to plan implementation. So for example, I've seen with a client who had their workforce plan kind of really baked in terms of policies and had a good learning and development plan to teach remote skills, but actually hadn't brought in the tech piece of it. So when they went to roll it out, there wasn't the right tech support needed to get that group up and running productively at the beginning. So all 3 of those things need to come together. And one of the things that I found interesting is I listened to Darren Murph today from GitHub, so head of remote at GitHub. He was on a South by Southwest webcast today. And it made me think about how, so there are these people, right, that are heads of remote. So in tech, there are people who that is their role. And maybe, Liam, you want to tell the group a little bit about what that role is.
Oh boy, there's so many new experts that are popping up, particularly inside of large tech companies. I know Shopify just ended up hiring a director of location independence, which is a very sexy technical version of basically a lot of their employees are becoming digital nomads, and then they need to be able to adapt to that reality and try to make sure that they're having a good work experience. And these types of positions are popping up everywhere. I know they already exist at GitLab. They're going to exist more so at Twitter, Google, Facebook, all of these large tech companies. So they're really going to be leading the way, and I think they're going to be kind of the tip of the spear that everyone else is going to learn from over the next couple of years.
And what was so interesting when I was listening to him talk is it reminded me, I had forgotten I had done this about 3 years ago. So I was a marketing director at Clorox, and on in my spare job, in my spare time, I was helping to teach virtual leadership skills. I was helping the company internally work across different office sites and with fully remote people. And I created a job description for myself. And I think I called it something like Director of Virtual Collaboration or something like that. And I had pitched it up the chain. I pitched it to HR. I pitched it up the business chain. I was like, hey, like, could you guys make this role for me? And I got crickets. I got, why would we need that? You know, I saw that we needed that, but nobody else at the time saw that they needed it. And I actually think that this is going to be the turning point where these large companies are now going to say, actually, we need to have some of this capability in-house to help us through this.
Not to necessarily toot your own horn, but how much money do you think Clorox would have saved had they have actually made that position for you?
Well, I think Clorox is probably the bad example. I would say like other companies would have saved maybe even millions of dollars by having some of that capability in-house to enable this transition to go faster and not lose productivity. And the reason I took Clorox out of that answer was because I had created at Clorox the first ever virtual workforce employee resource group. And so this group was in place that was helping the organization to learn how to work across distance. We had a whole leadership team. We rolled up to the director of diversity and inclusion. We had quarterly meetings with the executive committee of this $6 billion company. And so when COVID hit, I was in contact with the CEO of Clorox and some of the executive team members. And I was like, you guys are ready for this, because Orbit, which is the name of the group, existed. And I was like, you've got Orbit, you can tap into them and you're good. And so what we hadn't realized was the work that we put in back in like 2012 to get ready was helping for what we would have thought it would occur, which is this pandemic.
Right. Point 5. Bring us home.
Point 5. So the last one. So embrace location inclusion and location diversity when it comes to career development and hiring. Old school attitudes need to change. And this is really hard, right? We're talking about companies that might be over 100 years old.
Right.
So, and we might have executives in place that have worked at that company for 50 years or even 30 years. And when you think about these companies, these are deeply entrenched cultures and mindsets. And the good news is that COVID has forced change on people. So, with new constraints come, new thinking. But I want to give you an example, a personal example, so that you understand some of this old school thinking. So when I went remote back in 2010, I had been at the company for about 6 years. And that's why they were willing to let me move to Philadelphia across the country. And they said, okay, you can be an experiment, but you will never get promoted. You will never get to work on certain businesses because those businesses have to be run out of our headquarters. And you are going to move from a high potential employee to a low potential employee, not because your skills change, but because potential is linked to promotability, which is linked to location.
Got it.
And, for me, I heard that and I
chains.
Said, what did you say?
We need to break those chains, basically.
Exactly. And it took me 8 years, but over the course of 8 years, I broke the chains. I got promoted. I got to work on those businesses. They delinked potential from location, but it was a long, hard process. And I think COVID has sped up that process, but we have to get over the last, 5 feet to the end line to help people to actually embrace that when it comes to things like project assignments thinking about equal opportunity across locations, role rotations, promotions, all calibration discussions. So these are large meetings that happen on an annual cadence or a couple times a year cadence, talking about their people. You need to bring in the location question and make sure that you are having location inclusion, location diversity, and equal opportunity.
Got it. Yeah. No, I mean, these things are all, to be completely honest with you, past my pay grade, but I believe that they are all very, very true. If people wanted to learn a little bit more about, what you do, your consultancy, all that kind of stuff, where should they go find you?
Sure. So at my website, virtualworkinsider.com, it goes over, all my services. It includes some free remote resources that you can download. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Sacha Connor. I am trying to, on a daily basis, either put out an easy tip or let you be aware of the different events that I'm running or speaking at as well.
Yeah, she's got a good LinkedIn. I've been on it. It's pretty fun. So if you guys liked that video, please give this video a thumbs up. If you didn't like this video, give it a thumbs down. Did this video setup look stupid to you? Or was it genius? Should I keep doing it? Please put that down in the comments below. And if you work for an enterprise company, I'd love to know down in the comments, are you working remotely? Are you not working remotely? Are you going to go back? Are you not going to go back? This is the question that everyone doesn't really know. And I'd love to be able to get some answers. And I'm sure Sacha, if there's any questions down in the comments, she'll answer them as well. See you in the next video.